Welcome everyone, Simon here from the Whales of Wall Street. We have an XDC video for you guys today, looking a bit more detail into the trade finance aspects of things. The $19 trillion market, absolutely humongous number right there. Of course, XDC has its part to play, a significant part to play in many aspects as well, and taking some of that market share of such a gigantic industry with a multitude of different components within that. Before we go into a bit more detail, guys, don't forget to smash that subscribe button, and of course check out the other videos on the channel. More recently, really cool interviews with the likes of Andre Carsterman. We covered a couple of different projects as well in the last week, ones that have been on my watch list for some time and just maybe potentially about to dabble into those. And also there's a really cool video in there more recently as well of my top portfolio listings and some kind of like recommendations really and learnings from the last 5 years. Hope you find that interesting. Guys, let's go into a bit more detail around this topic. Now, XDC network, a lot of people have been following this in relation to the trade finance aspects around the world right now, and particularly here in the UK, where we had the Electronic Trade Documents Act going live from the 20th of September, so a few days ago now. And Chris Holmes, who's one of the Lords here in the UK British Parliament, recently stood up in Parliament and very much came to a really cool conversation amongst the other Lords and representatives of our Parliament, and was saying that the really cool aspect of the fact that this is the Trade Act, or the Act in general, one of the most important, if not maybe the most important act in our lifetime, of which no one's ever heard of or indeed knew that even blockchain was integrated within this as a technology integration aspect to it as well. So I'm not just suggesting that Zinf and XDC is the only one involved in this. Of course, there's a multitude of chains, because at the end of the day, every country and every region around the world is going to be utilizing their own systems, their own frameworks, whether that be central bank digital currency basis, stable coins in terms of depositories and creditory aspects of notation and transaction, and more importantly as well, the tokenization of assets and the NFT application. Now, we need to try and start moving away from that NFT ethos, the non-fungible token aspect. This was relatively a marketing name that was given to everything about a year or so ago, where everyone jumped on the bandwagon about pieces of art, etc. And absolutely, it does cater for art, but it also covers for many other physical assets, tokenized opportunity assets, cars, houses, you name it. And particularly in the supply chain areas, that's quite interesting when we start talking about commodities and other material items that get transported around the world through supply chain mechanisms and other forms of both transport and logistics. It becomes really interesting as we develop, because obviously blockchain has a huge part to play in that. Zinfin boasts the application, or the ability at least, to have a public or a private blockchain solution, hence why it was always deemed as a hybrid solution, Zinfin as a whole. But with this Electronic Trade Documents Act coming into effect a few days ago, like literally live, it had the Royal Assent a couple of months ago, we covered that on the channel. The representation of this is absolutely huge, and what was really interesting was one of the first instances, or arguably the first electronic trade document actually occurring within this time frame as well. It's a bit of a weird one, it's a bit of a skewed one here, but the point being is the saving of time, the efficiency, the cost effectiveness, the sustainability potentially as well. We'll go into a bit more of a topic around this, because someone made a comment the other day when I did the YouTube short about this particular scenario, was around, well, why is that important? And of course, this is very early on, guys. You've got to understand that, you know, things are still developing, and it may not sound like much, but actually when you look at the intricate detail, it does make a huge difference. So I'm just going to read this out quickly. This is from the XDC network news. So this is quite interesting. So it's relating to Lloyds Bank and Matalan, a company called NGO, who do a really cool solution called Trace Original. This is about documentation in the format of electronic capability. We'll go through a few diagrams in a second. It shows you the comparison between the traditional paper methods that we've been using for decades, if not hundreds of years, maybe even millennia, being converted into an electronic format, and why that's important for the economy, how it speeds things up, it reduces that cost, all those things we just mentioned, right? So Here's an example. So one notable example highlighting the efficiency gains of electronic trade documentation comes from Lloyds Bank, which recently executed a transaction for Matalan Retail Limited. So for those that don't know, Matalan is a retail outlet here in the UK. I don't know if it's worldwide or anything or any other countries, but in the UK, it's not huge, but they have some really cool, like, I would argue like warehouses, for a better term, that you can go in and you can very much get all sorts of different ranges of things, from clothing to household items, etc. They're using this company NGO, who I just mentioned just a minute ago about the trace original aspect, which is what we covered on the YouTube short. In this case, a digital promissory note replaced the conventional paper-based process. The result, the critical documents arrived 2 days earlier, showcasing the tangible benefits of embracing digital trade finance solutions. Now, you're sitting there and totally understand that question. Is like, okay, it arrived 2 days earlier, so what? Well, the point being here is a multitude of reasons, really, why this is so interesting. Is, first of all, the speed efficiency. If you think about how much time is taken with paper admin, emails back and forth, the amount of people that are used within this system, whether it be reconciling, the finance systems, you name it, the whole spectrum of staffing involved, and then the time consumption of making that payment processed and validated and then secured, and then actually the remittance of that, the actual messaging implementations in behind this, hence why we find the RTGS system evolution over the next year or so very interesting as well, because that operates in itself 720 billion pounds a day. So if we can speed all this up, the economy can speed up, because we're reducing the cost and we're increasing the efficiency. And ultimately, when all these things happen, if you think about this from a supply chain mechanism, and I'm going to try and think about this from an example of my personal experiences when working in the distribution, which ultimately led through supply chain mechanisms, because we obviously had to like forecast things 6 months, 12 months ahead. I used to go to retailers' head offices, and they would have like supermarkets. Literally, it would look real, but it's got fake stuff in it. And it's like a piloting supermarket, and you go in there and you'd see like Christmas trees, but you'd see them in like March for next year. And like Mother's Day, Father's Day was always done almost a year in advance, picking what flowers should be put out. And there's like 5 people sat around a table, blah, blah. My point being is that the planning ahead is very important, the forecasting. But a lot of that is also budgetary, in terms of like, okay, have we got a purchase order for this? Has that purchase order been paid for? But then the speed of which, most cases, sometimes we give like 30 days for companies to pay things. And there's loads of different reasons for that, the bending of financial results and stuff like that. Not from a like a strange way. I'm talking about like the aspect of some people want to give leeway because of the way their finance is done on a monthly basis, weekly, etc., and the balancing of the books with other headovers as well. So when we got these things going on, it becomes incredibly more important that we could actually reduce all of that time scale. And when things are paid quicker, we can react to other things quicker. We can get more inventory in, for example. We could potentially hire more people because more money is coming in quicker and faster. And when that data builds, the algorithm of it becomes even more important as well, because then you can start forecasting based on actual proper data. Whereas at the moment it's very manual and takes up a lot of time. In some instances, I remember about 10 years ago, it was very easy to forecast things based on a yearly trend. You knew when Christmas was coming, you knew when you need to get orders of products in or supply from vendors of your products to distribute. But your Amazon came along and that wiped the whole thing out. Companies didn't know what was going on in the retail sphere because, oh, hang on a minute, people are supposed to be buying between this like October kind of period, maybe sometimes a bit earlier, or at least into November, and everyone was waiting because they came up with the idea of Black Friday and everyone was like, oh, we can save money. So they jumped into that area. So all of these things come into fruition and they collaborate with all these kind of decision makings and how forecasting is done, how much a company can bring in, how much can they sell in that time. If the inventory is sat there, it becomes an issue. So all of the AI integration that's coming very much in the near future within this vicinity of a sector and industry, including IoT in terms of the machine to machine learning, the data algorithm, all included within blockchain for the transparency, the validation, the processing, the speed at which these actions or transfer of actions can be done, i.e. transactions, becomes really imperative. So when we loop this back around to these kind of like 2 days earlier, it starts to make a bit more sense in terms of how things can speed up, the cost efficiency of potential reduction in the use of people. And that sounds crazy. And I've always said, like, cryptography arguably potentially is the demise of society in many different ways, and particularly from the job spectrum. We talk about like machines and robotics, AI, etc. taking over, but ultimately the processes themselves, when they become more automated and streamlined and very heavily integrated with AI and IoT, that becomes even more so than ever before. So some really interesting documentations here. This is through the NGO platforms, and it's a really cool way to look at it. I'll leave a link of this in the description below. But it's very much a comparison in a visual format of a physical document, the intermediaries involved potentially, versus the electronic capability of this. And then obviously there's a diagram here showing the incremental balancing act, if you like, of the control and ownership aspect, the traceability, etc., and then the security and the integrity, and how electronic is way up in the highest levels of both of those spectrums compared to the existing paper modules, as well as potential kind of like scanned papers, etc., like that, which you can kind of understand. But this is quite interesting. So you also got your paper, you're adding content, the managing of the documentation, then you've got the transportation of that, or the scanning, or the physicality of storing that information in receipts or filing cabinets, blah blah blah, and all of these other things. And then the processing of that, and particularly from an auditing perspective, can take a long time. Then you've got to pay contractors to come in and audit all your information, your finances, and all these things. Whereas if it was done electronically, yes, there's still relatively, you could argue there's similar step numbers, but most of it's all electronic and automated, and this is just how it will work. So you just have one person instead of several doing all these things. Or if you've got a really good system in there and you're inputting data yourself as part of your job already, that will be taken over from all the other people that would come into fruition for that. So it says here about artificial intelligence, the holding of it, the validation, the verification, everything, utilizing things like Swift, emails, etc., the e-storage, which, you know, if we look at e-storage, we're not just talking about things like Dropbox and cloud services. This can also be things like Filecoin, for example. This is where we start building a really interesting ecosystem, all these things involved: Oracle platforms, SaaS platforms, IoT, AI, blockchain in particular, and how this all coordinates together and comes together. It's really fascinating. And I was reading some crazy statistics about how much money is used and how many pieces of paper are used still by the average office person in an office environment, and how much, not necessarily the cost of the paper, which is still, well, quite high to be honest, is still that processing mentality that will be coming backwards from that. So again, taking a lot of that cost aspect out, a company can really push itself forward, and it can start developing other things more. It can start developing its platforms, its websites, etc. So there's all these like really interesting things to consider when you look at this. And that's actually one or two examples of how and why this 2-day thing is so magnified, why people are so interested in it. Well, how is this even a thing? Like 2 days doesn't sound like much, but it is when you look at the whole business spectrum and all these things that are collaborating with it. We've gone into a bit more conversation around XDC's aspect to this. Of course, they were one of the first, if not the first, blockchain company to join the TFD Initiative, the TFDI. So these guys are a huge organization involving a lot of different people. Andre Customers, of course, on these boards and advisory aspects as well, integrating the likes of multitude of banks and world trade organizations coming under one roof to learn and educate and integrate, more importantly, things, as we just mentioned, like blockchain, the utilization of smart contracts, or that application of non-fungible tokens, tokenized assets, in other words, all within these frameworks and these systems. So we're just mentioning here around the XDC's network, and this was taken, I believe, from Andre Customer originally. Emerging technologies such as distributed ledgers are being promoted as a way to create smart contracts, computer programs which run automatically, in whole or in part, without the need of human intervention. For England and Wales, smart contracts are expected to increase efficiency and certainty in business and reduce the need for contracting parties to have to trust each other. To trust resides instead in the code. The trust resides in the code instead. And then going on from Andre's perspective, which was really interesting as well, the TFD Initiative provides the most comprehensive set of trade distribution capabilities. We welcome XINFIN XDC network to TFD Initiative, as this enables us to bridge the US $19 trillion trade finance asset class with any type of funder through tokenization and digital assets. So we've got this aspect of speeding up processing of finances, and the administrative side of it, but we've also got the entire supply chain mechanism built on supply and demand data, built on the fact that many things could be tokenized, traced, validated, and we've got so many big targets and sustainability goals for 2030 through the UN, through the World Economic Forum, and things like the World Trade Organization. They're all part of the same ecosystem of organizations, of course. It becomes massively imperative. This was quite interesting. I'll just throw this in there before we go on to the next part of the topic. In relation to Lloyds Bank and NGO, this gives you a bit of an indication, guys, of the speed of which transactions and processing can be done with the utilization of smart contracts, KYC, etc., etc. This was a pilot, so it's not real, but it gives you the initiation, which we talked about on this channel for so long, especially in the aspect of property. The pilot transaction, which was also the first under the International Trade and Forfeiting Associations, i.e. ITFA, Digital Negotiable Instrumental Initiative, DNI, saw the sale and purchase of land worth £48 million, which was completed between several UK businesses within one single day. One single day. The underlying promissory note was issued using Trace Original, which is the big project of NGO, or the solution-based project of NGO, showcasing, as we've said on this channel so many times, what's going to be happening in real estate in these coming years. Property, commercial, residential, the ability of tokenization of assets, paying for them, buying them, will be done within milliseconds, not months at all anymore. We're not even talking about weeks. We're talking about a day. This is crazy. It sounds crazy, but this is the opportunity of blockchain. And as I said, XINFIN XDC is by far no means the only blockchain involved in these particular sectors or opportunities. We've talked about loads of different projects on this channel that can be easily applied to these methods of thought process and the ability of the utilization of blockchain smart contracts. But I wanted to put that point out there because even from the trade finance perspective, we're just talking about property there and how 6 or 7 companies came together in one hit with all their identification, digital identities through smart contracts, everything about their businesses, everything financially, all secured. It's all private, everything like that. The transaction may be public. You could see the money transfer or something like this potentially with the use of blockchain, depending on how restricted they are. Point being is the speed of it. The speed is phenomenal. And then you think about it, oh, hang on a minute, all the people that used to be involved in land registry or deeds or housing estate agencies and all these things, well, what are we all going to do? Because jobs will just disappear off the face of the earth. I'll read this little statement here just to emphasize, because this comes from the World Economic Forum, quite interestingly. By increasing transparency and making it possible to automate processes and payments, blockchain has the potential to reduce trade costs significantly, including verification, networking, processing, coordination, transportation, and logistics, as well as financial intermediation and exchange rate costs. Although it is difficult to assess the extent to which the deployment of blockchain technology will affect trade costs, preliminary indications at hand tend to point to the notable impact. Cost reduction estimates in the financial sector and the shipping industry range from 15 to 30% of total costs. According to the World Economic Forum, the removal of barriers due to blockchain could result in more than an additional $1 trillion of new trade in the next decade alone. So you go to companies and you say, hey guys, would you like to save between 15 and 30% off your total costs a year? Well, no one's going to say no if they were sensible. I mean, some might have morals and want to keep people, etc. But at the end of the day, if you want to keep up in this world, it has to be through the technological advancements that are available to you, if applicable, of course. So there's some numbers, guys. So when we're asking about that 2-day aspect of it, and you're saying, well, why is this interesting? Well, from a business perspective, it's interesting. If you loop that round to shareholders of a business, for example, that are making more profit because of this kind of thing, it makes the world go round, guys. And to eliminate days or weeks or months off something and reduce costs significantly, this is where it becomes very exciting. And then we loop back around to that whole entire topic of why these blockchains, or how the utility of a token works. Most of the tokens are used to build on the infrastructure of those chains, or they're used as burning mechanisms or part of the transaction validation or processing within those chains. This is where the monetary value or the demand of a token within a chain such as XDC becomes extremely prominent. I'm going to leave as many links as possible as I can in the description of all these things. It's really fascinating. NGO goes into a lot of detail about how trace original works and the documentation factors of this, how we can then start applying. All I ask you guys is to not always have to educate yourself about this fully, but open the mind and think about this in a logical format of like how logistics, supply chain, trade will work together, but then also on a macro level, whichever way you want to look at it, from the business orientation, SMEs, how this is going to make a giant difference. And I have no doubt in my mind that Lloyds and Matalan have used this example because it's a retail opportunity, and there's a lot of retailers there's a lot of grocers out there, especially here in the UK, and there are across the world. And this is ultimately not just for supply chain management systems and trade systems. This is trying to open. It's exactly what Lord Holmes has been saying, what everyone was saying on the webinars the other week in the Trade Finance Initiative organization's webinars, was that this is now the time of education and letting people know, letting SMEs know, and we need to all work together to push that. And I'm not even pushing this, I'm just talking about it because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it's not until I've been doing the research over the last few months on this massive topic, and obviously having Andre on the show more recently as well, has opened my eyes to see, wow, this is actually probably the most gigantic financial act ever in UK history, and something that will be replicated around the world because they will need to catch up. They will need to be orchestrating this together, especially if you're talking about cross-border payments and all these things. And then you ask yourself, well, hang on a minute, we're talking about a $19 trillion trade market. What about all the other markets, guys, where we're talking about interoperability of chains, because each country, as I said, will use different APIs and frameworks. And then we start thinking about how we settle payments. And this is, of course, where the infrastructure frameworks and powering through blockchain, AI, and OT start powering things like CBDCs, stable coins. It starts to make sense. And I've always said by 2025 November, the RTGS system gets switched on. I have no doubt in my mind that CBDCs will be in play. In fact, I saw this morning about the Russian ruble digitalized will be in effect and used by the public in 2025. Very coincidental, isn't it? The timing of all this. As we lead to the RTGS engine being switched on in 2024. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and check out the video that's either on the platform of Wells of Wall Street on YouTube as the first thing you see when you open up the channel's features. Otherwise, I will leave a link or a video option at the end of this one, because it's absolutely staggering, guys. And it's being swept through right now through all our banks. All you have to do is either type in RTGS or ISO 222 in your existing personal bank website, Santander, Barclays, you name it. They've all written about it. And particularly NatWest have a really interesting webinar and things around via the BIS, of course, that infrastructure towards November 2025. And looping this back again to XDC, I've held XDC for some time. I continue to build my accumulation of this token and project, especially with its heavy integrations within the trade finance. And someone again in the comments the other day was like, well, is there any enterprise partners, etc.? And I'm like, well, they haven't openly sort of suggested. I've mentioned a few in the reply to them, but you've got to look bigger than that. Because it's not always just about, oh, they partner with this bank, they partner with this bank. It's a given, guys, because if they're creating the frameworks for the entire trade finance system, or at least a big part of it, they're going to be involved regardless with these banks, and those banks will have to work with those systems. So the answer to that main question is, okay, they may not publicly show or have full knowledge in the public domain of who their enterprise or partners are. although they list some, especially their ecosystem partners. But predominantly, when you look at the bigger picture of this $19 trillion market, you're not going to be avoiding the likes of Zimfin, XDC as a usage component to this whole system, as you wouldn't with other chains as well. And it's really fascinating, guys. Sorry for the slight waffling on here. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but let's go on to the chart quickly for XDC. It's looping into the areas that we kind of projected in the last video that we did. I'm still potentially waiting around that sort of 4.7 cent mark to see if I can grab some of those areas, but it's really stabilizing itself at around that 5 cent mark. I'm just going to remove some of these wonderful drawings that I made in the last video so you can see that in a bit more detail. I'll just drag this across slightly as well, and then what I'm also going to do is just add a bit of a micro chart in here from one of the most recent high points and low points, just so we can get a bit of understanding and structure on something that might be happening in more of the short term. So taking that lower area, which is ironically also hitting one of those red points on one of the longer range fib levels, as much as we can see in these dark blue areas. So that's a good matchup there, gives us a bit more orientation as to what's going on. If we zoom in a bit closer, we can see there's a slight orientation around, so I should be putting that, there we go, down to, I should probably actually not cheat and put it down to its proper value. There we go. So we can start seeing that there's a bit of a play around here around 5.3 cents. So we've seen some resistance on the way down. It's pulled itself back up to some of these areas after some announcements, etc. And now we're playing around with this area again. If this fails over the next few days, we could potentially anticipate that 4.7 retest. And that kind of makes sense in my head, because if we trace back, not beyond this point here of the 20th of April, where we got to 4.6 cents the last time round, we shot through that in the 25th of July. After those big announcements that came out, it shot upwards and it's slowly trickling its way down to match up with previous areas that we drew back here. So when we look at these data points, it becomes really fascinating because again, in the whole history of XDC, I can still argue that there's not enough entry or data points, at these particular areas of around 4.4 to 4.7 cents. So in my opinion, we still have to retest this area a couple more times before we can upward trend ourselves even more. And ultimately, nothing major is going to happen probably this year at all, because we'll have 2024, 2025 leading up to all the switch-ons, the engines, the finance systems, etc., etc. Of course, we might have some mini cycles between then, like we've seen here, and opportunities around announcements, but in the grand scheme of things, we have to also be very sensible. We can identify and confirm this at this area here as well, where we tried to break that resistance, couldn't quite do it, and it dropped all the way back down to 3 cents. And again, even these lower areas can still not be ticked off in our minds, which is why when I DCA, I look at various different opportunities. So I do have the buy orders still at 4.7 cents, and I do miraculously still have some, I think it's around 3.4 cents, just in case we come and retest those areas. But I don't hold too much hope for that just yet. But it's certainly something that we can at least potentially anticipate. Who knows, guys? If it can go up this high quickly, it can also come down low quickly. If all it takes is a market crash at some point to really dip down to lower levels quite quickly and maybe just snap some up. So in some instances, I might actually even have some, not necessarily just at 4.7, I might have some just above 4 cents. So we hit some of these fib levels here. That might be a sensible solution for myself. None of this is financial advice, it's just what I'm doing personally, is what I've been working for a long time. I like to DCA, dollar cost average in. It removes risk significantly, and you can start taking areas of interest of accumulation. If you're a long-term holder like I am, that's really good, in my opinion, as a strategy or a thought process. But for sure, if you're a short-term trader, of course, there's loads of opportunities. I mean, look how many you guys probably out there short-term trading have had multiple opportunities in the last few months, quite exciting ones, I would have thought, albeit to the untrained eye, 5 cents to 6.6 cents may not sound massive, but if you've got good volume of those or accumulation levels, then of course it is a big deal. But yes, as we trend ourselves back down, performance side, on the right hand side here, we can see that we're slightly negative on the week and the month now. It's caught up with itself. Still green on the other areas, but that is partially skewed by those two upward big boosts up from March to April in 2023 and this marker here from July to the beginning of August respectively. Two big areas of interest there, which are keeping those numbers quite high. But as you can see, the 6 month is reducing quite a bit. So that's what I'm waiting for really, guys, is a bit of stability around here. See if we can pull back down to these areas. But as I drew in the last video and with those ones that I just removed, don't be surprised to see a bit of a upward looping moment before we might retest these areas properly. So just keep that in mind. From today's perspective, 14-day on the bottom left-hand side here, 14 days showing 43, 28 days showing 48. For me, it's still slightly too high. I'm going to wait a couple of days to see if there's more stability, and that might bring that 14-day to around 40, 41, and the 28-day more nearer to 44, 45 is more interesting to me. So I'll keep an eye on that, guys. I will do a YouTube short if anything spectacular happens, but hopefully we've thought about loads of really cool things in this video. It's got your mind open. I'd love you guys to go out there, research more yourselves about the whole entire trade finance sector, who's involved, and particularly the XDC's Infin's orientation around this. It's really fascinating to understand the technology, or at least understand the processes, or why this is such a big deal. Because I think, yes, you might not see some immediate results, and people always ask, oh, with this going on, why is the price so low? The fact of the matter is, this is so early, guys, and trade, particularly the trade industry, will see giant effects of this over the coming years. That's what I'm more excited about. Guys, thanks for watching this one. We'll see you in the next XDC video update. Take care. Bye-bye.